Hello and welcome to Unacademy, one-stop destination for civil services aspirants in English. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we pick up today's the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper, analyze the important articles, declutter the complexities which are present in those articles, and utilize that in order to understand what is usable and important for the examination, be it for the prelims or the mains exam. And at the end of this entire discussion, we shall be taking a couple of questions, practice questions from the mains perspective, and we shall also be analyzing how to weave your answer around those particular questions. Now, before we initiate the discussion, a couple of announcements. First of all, so today, free class and the special class schedule goes as it is. So here at 12 p.m. we will have History Revisited, where we shall be talking about the unification of Germany, which shall be taken by Abhishek sir. At 5 p.m. about modern India revision through questions, again by Abhishek sir. At 7 p.m. we shall be talking about the basics of geography, and we shall be analyzing about jet streams in significant detail. And at 8 p.m. we shall be talking about the society by Astha ma'am, and we shall be talking about the mapping of the social issues in news. So do attend these special classes, improve your understanding, and further deepen your conceptual clarity. Regardless of how complex the particular topics are, these special classes are meant for decluttering those and helping you get a detailed analysis and a detailed idea. Now, after this, another announcement regarding the classroom program for the evening batch, which is going to be launched, and we are going to launch that classroom program from the subject of economy in the evening batch, which will be followed subsequently by the other subjects as well. So you can join us for that. Now, coming to the topics that we are going to discuss for today. So today in total we are going to have a discussion for 7 different topics, out of which 4 of them can be relevant for your mains examination. From this also you will have snippets which are relevant for your prelims preparation, which we shall be focusing upon and analyzing wherever that situation arises. And then 3 of them relevant for your prelims only. So here, West pushing Russia closer to China. That has appeared in page 1. That is relevant for your GS paper 2. Now, this is on the backdrop of the Raisina dialogue which is being held, and on that Raisina dialogue, the comments made by our External Affairs Minister, that is something that we are going to discuss. And considering that today marks the 2 years since the Russia-Ukraine war actually initiated, so this holds a significant amount of relevance. Then changing the growth paradigm, this has appeared in the editorial section of the newspaper. It talks about that when we largely think about growth of a particular economy of a particular country, we have a certain West-defined model in our mind, how that needs to change and why that needs to change in the present context. Now, the NB8 visit to India focuses on cooperation and trust. What is NB8? The group of 8 countries from the Nordic and the Baltic regions of Europe. What those are and what this visit is about. Then India's stance on data transfers at WTO. Spooks industry giants, particularly the semiconductor industry group, has written a letter to the Prime Minister that how India's steps can lead to various issues in the semiconductor industry. But we shall be analyzing this article, what is India's stance and why is it that India has been holding that stance for a few years now. Now, that has appeared in page 14, again relevant for your GS paper 3. Now, certain topics for the prelims have been in discussion, have been in the newspaper. Aditya L1 PAPA module detects the coronal mass ejection. So, briefly, we shall be talking about the CMEs as well. The grey zone warfare, what that is, that again has been in news significantly for the past 2.5 years almost. And in the larger context, the post-Cold War scenario has observed this grey zone warfare, what that is. Now, PSBs can now check on big borrowers on a unified portal which has been developed. So who has developed that portal and how will that help? So these are the various topics that we are going to hold a discussion for. let us initiate the discussion with the first topic of the day, which has appeared in the editorial or in the front page of the newspaper rather, and that is West pushing Russia closer to China. And this is a statement that has been made by the External Affairs Minister. Now, on the sidelines of the Raisina dialogue, while there are various issues which are being discussed, and every day you will be bombarded with the various different statements issued by sometimes the chief of the naval staff, sometimes the external affairs ministers and the foreign ministers of different countries, and sometimes the visiting delegates of different areas and in their respective positions in their own regions. Now, this Raisina dialogue has got a significant amount of focus this time which it has paid on the Russia-Ukraine crisis which is going on. Majority of the European delegates which have been visiting and the Western delegates, when I say Western, by that I refer to the larger Western economies and the Western countries. So the European delegates who have been visiting, they have largely put forward a kind of an agenda and they want India to criticize Russia for its actions in Ukraine. And India has time and time again made its stance very clear that look, what Russia is doing is basically based out of its own perceptions of what is going out in the region. And India does not want to pick a side or choose a side. And India has also gone ahead and made the statement that look, Russia has never been bad to us. Russia has used its statecraft in order to help India. So in that context, it would be absolutely impractical to expect India to take a significant stance against Russia in the present scenario. However, India has also made it amply clear that when it comes to violation of human rights, when it comes to wanton killing of, let's say, certain events which have happened over the past 2 years where women and children have fallen prey to the Russian arms, India has heavily criticized that and has communicated it at the highest levels to the Russian delegates and, in certain cases, to the head of the state in Russia as well. So India has made its stance very clear, but for the Western nations, India's stance appears to be ambiguous. For them, it is like India is riding two boats at the same time. Because for them, they are looking at a polarized world. That either you are with us, that is the US and the West European countries, or you are completely against us. And this is where, after and post-independent India, since a continued period of time has made its stance significantly amplified and significantly permanent, that is, we are not going to fall into bloc politics again. The bloc politics of the Cold War, where you had two superpowers and you had to choose a side. We are going to take a look into our own interests. And wherever possible, whenever possible, on the practical basis, we will take a stance wherever required against human rights, etc. Now, in this backdrop, as these 2 years have passed, there is another news story which has been broken into the international page of the newspaper today, and that is US piles new sanctions on Russia on war's anniversary. And this is done by US as well as the European Union nations. They have been piling up sanctions after sanctions on Russia. They have been using words and statements against Russia, which is not helping anyone. So it is in that backdrop that the External Affairs Minister has made the statement. He has made it very, very clear that, look, when it comes to Russia, you need to provide them certain options. You cannot be closing the space around them. If, let's suppose, you are cutting down the financial means or the financial income that they can generate, let's suppose, the entire sector and the entire finances for them, if you are closing down, the expectation of the West is what? That let's suppose the Western nations are seeing that let's suppose if the money that Russia is getting, if that money supply in itself is cut off, eventually they can force Russia on its knees and then eventually they will make Russia do what they want, in the sense that they want Russia to completely withdraw from Ukraine and other things as well. And Russia cannot be seen to be doing that for its own national interests. Because for Russia, for the past 2 years, the global discussion has been so very polarized. Various statements made by the heads of states across the world have been so polarizing that for Russia to take a back step now would mean and would surmount to a kind of a subjugation to the Western forces, which would not be popular for the Russian public as well, and which would not be deemed to be suitable in the long run interests of the Russian nation. Because once in the international geopolitics, if you are seen to be taking a back step regarding any particular stance, any particular issue, and if the countries of the world have forced you into a certain decision, you are considered to be a weaker power, something that Russia does not want to be seen. Even though Russia is not as powerful as what it used to be during the Soviet era, but still, it wants to be seen at the big boys' table. It wants to be seen amongst the global decision makers. And that is where the External Affairs Minister is saying that, look, the entire world presently is closing the doors on Russia. And when you are closing the doors on Russia, your expectation is that Russia will back down. But that is never going to happen. So what you are creating a scenario is that invariably Russia will be pushed towards the side of China. Why? Because China is also anti-West, in the sense that the Western countries, they have also been significantly issuing various statements against China for various issues, be it for the trade practices that China is adopting, be it for the wolf warrior diplomacy that China has been adopting, be it for the various different predatory economic practices that it has been practicing. So the Western countries have been criticizing China as well, and China sees itself as anti-West. Now, if you have started criticizing Russia in the same way, if you have closed the doors for Russia all around, what you are doing inadvertently is pushing Russia into the same block as China, and that too for a permanent duration. And why is that the case? Because Russia has got the natural resources. Which natural resources? Oil and gas. And China is energy starved. So if push comes to shove, and the worst of the situations, Russia and China can always trade and can always end up benefiting each other. China has got a thriving defense industry of its own. It is no longer the China of the 90s, which was completely dependent on the Russian arms. And for the past couple of years, ever since the last year almost, there have been significant amount of arms and ammunitions which have been supplied by China to Russia. So in a way, the world is being led and coerced into another kind of a geopolitical warfare, where Western countries, they have put all their might on the side of Ukraine. And as the editorial piece a couple of days back by the Chief of Naval Staff of the UK, they said that UK has put an estimated amount of 12 billion pounds into the war effort. US has put an additional amount. Think about it. The whole Western world is putting in amounts in Ukraine. And now China is also pumping in money. Russia is pumping all its money from the other side. So it is no longer a war for any result. It has been turned into a war of attrition. And that is where the peaceful outcome is going to be increasingly difficult to attain. So that is where India has also been heightening its stance and heightening its entire argument that, look, if you want a peaceful solution, if you want a peaceful negotiation, don't close the doors to Russia. If you are going to close the doors to Russia, what you are going to do is increase the polarization. And when you will increase the polarization, formation of global blocks. Okay? The formation of global blocks. And that would take the world into the Cold War era. Into Cold War politics. Right? So that is what India has been arguing. And that is what the External Affairs Minister has been saying. And as you can see, another article which has appeared in the international page of the newspaper today, that on the mark of the second anniversary, various different Russian businessmen, bankers, their middlemen, all of them and their assets have been seized. So in a way, the Western world has become a no-go area for the Russian business and the Russian money. So what will this lead to? This will lead to huge amount of money laundering, right? So the impact of it can be debilitating. The huge amount of black economy can be generated. As a result of this, the commodity prices, which are very relevant in today's world, commodity prices, be it the prices of oil, right? Be it the prices of grains, these commodity prices can be seen to be spiraling up in the near future. So for that, what is the way forward? You need a solution, and you need a solution urgently. And how do you provide that solution? Lower down the tempo. Don't say those things. Don't make those statements just for headline grabbing. And lower down the tempo. Understand what the Russian side is actually looking for. Not subjugate to entirety of the demands, but think about a meaningful and peaceful dialogue and solution. And this is where India is positioning and placing itself as the adequate and apt mediator which can achieve the end result. But the world is also eyeing at China to do the same thing, right? So that is where these countries are, and they want to end the conflict. But understand, China is benefiting from this war indirectly because of its arms industry, because of the cheaper oil that even India is getting, but India is not benefiting in terms of its vast exports. So that is why China has got its tooth in the game. But for India, the final dialogue is the end goal, which the External Affairs Minister has been propagating. So that is the first article regarding the context and why that article has been listed. Now, before coming to the second article, a couple of minor announcements. We are going to launch a couple of programs. We're starting with the NCERT fundamentals. Now, these NCERT fundamentals shall include the various different subjects of economy, history, polity, geography, IR, all those subjects. The basics of the NCERT shall be covered. So we shall be starting with economy and portions of history. And then another program that we are going to launch is the PIB Weekly and IR Weekly exclusively on the app. That is going to be every Monday and every Tuesday. So do follow the app. Now coming to the second article, which has appeared in the editorial section, which is relevant for your GS paper 3. Now what is this article about? It says, changing the growth paradigm. What do we mean by that? What do we mean by changing the growth paradigm? So here, the author or the writer basically argues that, look, Indian economy, ever since past couple of decades, if you consider, Indian economy has been growing at an average rate of around 7 to 7.2%. That is the argument in the article. So the GDP growth rate that all of us value so much, which is important nonetheless, which is significantly important. There is no denying the fact that the GDP growth rate should happen. So the GDP growth rate, which is very important, is at 7.2%. But then, despite growing at this significantly high rate for the past 20 years, the outcome, the tangible outcomes are not there. Still, you have impoverishment at a significant portion. Even though the poverty rates have come down, but impoverishment is there. Inequality is growing, right? So, what kind of growth is this? are we falling prey to the entire model of growth economy that was shown to us by the Western economies and the Western countries? So here, the logic which for a long period of time has been that, look, increase the size of your economy. If the size of your economy, let's suppose, goes higher, then the share that the population will get will also be higher. The logic that if you increase the size of the cake, the size of the slices that you get will also be larger, right? So that is the larger economic model due to which the countries chase the economic growth rate. That is why if the economic growth rates are good, it does make national headlines and good headlines for that matter. But still, in the case or in the face of rising inequalities, right, in the face of still ravaging poverty, what do? India is not, and you will hear various different economists from previous RBI governor Raghuram Rajan to various different esteemed economists. All of them, they keep on saying that India needs to grow at a faster rate. We do need to grow at a faster rate, which is fine. But why? Because of what the Western model tells us. That is at least what the article is saying. Now, what does the Western model tell us? That when it comes to economic growth, there is a transition. Initially, you will find that the society as well, society in itself transitions from rural to urban, right? And when it comes to sectors of economy, during this transition, in the initial stage when the country is not significantly developed, the economy is largely agrarian, where agricultural productivity is the mainstay and is the main component and the main chunk of the national income. But once that country starts progressing, once the income level starts going higher up, then that agrarian sector gives way to the manufacturing sector. That gives way to the manufacturing sector. And eventually, that manufacturing sector, as the growth further propels forward, as you will see in many of the countries such as, for example, UK. UK is an ideal example for that. US is also one of the ideal examples. US, though, still has a very significant amount of agrarian economy, but it transitioned almost a century and more back into a manufacturing powerhouse and a manufacturing giant. And after that, there has been a transition to the services sector. Right? So the services sector then further augment your income levels. That is at least the model that the world is following. So agrarian will lead to manufacturing, manufacturing will lead to services growth. In our case, we have skipped a step. In our case, agrarian economy was dominant, and after the agrarian economy, it was the services sector which developed, the IT sector, the hospitality sector, the airline business, for example, that has shown a tremendous amount of increase. It is the manufacturing sector which has been stymied, whose growth has been limited. And that is seen as a major hiccup why India is not developing at the rate that it should. And that is where you will find successive governments for the past almost 2.5 decades. Their only concentration is somehow to increase the manufacturing sector's importance and role in the national income. That is why various schemes like Make in India, etc., they are of such paramount importance, because we want to increase the share of the manufacturing sector so as to follow this transitionary path. Now, this article argues that this entire transitionary path that we are following, do we need to follow this path? Or do we need to change the growth paradigm? Because this path had been indicated by countries like US, UK and the Western European nations. But who is to say that this is the only path to achieve growth? Yes, few countries have achieved growth by this. But do we need to find a newer model of growth? If yes, first of all, why is there a need to find a newer model of growth? What can be the reason for that? So here, in order to understand that, there is a conundrum of the fossil fuel that one needs to understand. What is the conundrum of fossil fuel? See, the US, the Western European nations, they developed in an era through the 1800s, through the 1900s, where climate change was caused by them eventually. But at that point of time, the world was not facing that much impact of climate change as it is facing today. And climate actions were not of that much greater prominence as it is today. So while they could burn fossil fuels at an absolutely wanton and unsustainable manner, if we follow the same path, can we afford to follow the same process of burning the fossil fuels? While developing nations have been saying that, look, when we will be developing, we will be also emitting, so we don't need any targets on us. We will be requiring that development path, and something that India has also held as its stance. Despite all its climate commitments and all the ambitious climate goals, India has maintained that stance that we cannot compromise in our developmental journey, and we will not hesitate to burn fossil fuels if that requires or if that will lead to fulfillment of the needs of the citizen. So we will be doing that. But then, when you talk about the normal growth paradigm or the normal growth pattern, there have been 4 foundational materials which have been indicated, that is steel, concrete, plastic and food. This is very much important for development. Steel and concrete, let's suppose. Now, construction of highways, construction of airports, railways, buildings, anything would require steel and concrete. That is why steel and concrete, they are also referred to as the backbone of a country's economic development. If the steel sector is doing good, the country would develop rapidly because that steel is being utilized. Historically, UK, US, and more recently, even Germany, and more recently, China, for all their growth and sudden growth, if you observe the economic trends in that region, you will find that excess and exponential economic growth and development was preceded by a significant growth in the steel sector. So the steel sector is required to grow at a very fast pace. But the argument is that the steel sector, as we had pointed out in the previous newspaper analysis videos as well, that the steel sector is significantly carbon intensive. It is produced by utilization of significant amount of fossil fuels. That is, steel mostly utilizes the burning of coal, right? And coal has a significant amount of emission levels. So that is where it is carbon intensive. So it will exacerbate the problem of global warming, right? And so is the case with the concrete sector. So is the case with the plastic sector. Plastics are finding increased amount of utilization and significant usage in our day-to-day lives, where let's suppose consumer durables to packaging industry to various different industry, they use that plastic in various different proportions, isn't it? So in that scenario, but plastic, if you look at it, even plastic uses what? Plastic uses fossil fuels. Right. In our present day context, food security is being talked about endlessly. But for that production of food, and in order to increase the productivity of food, what do you need? You need application of fertilizers. Amongst the fertilizers that we use in our country, for example, the most rampant fertilizer used in our country is urea. Urea provides what? Urea provides nitrogen to the soil. It ends up providing nitrogen to the soil. And since all the soil types are poor in nitrogen, almost all the soil types, so urea is the most significant amount of fertilizer which is used. Now these fertilizers, for their production also, what is required? Fossil fuel. So if you follow the normal growth pattern that the world has followed and the world has indicated, you will end up guzzling fossil fuels at a rate which is unprecedented. And for a country like India, with a billion-plus population and significant amount of youthful population, the needs and the demands for energy and food security is going to increase in the coming decades. Can we afford to burn fossil fuels at the rate if we are already facing the impact of climate change? Lack of winter snowfall in Kashmir leading to avalanches. Unseasonal rainfall in March leading to crop losses. Heat waves in the month of late March and April leading to the loss of crops such as wheat. Again, unseasonal and insignificant amount of rainfall in June and excessive amount of rainfall in July leading to loss of paddy crop. Can we afford to continue to emit and use fossil fuel in order to grow? We are facing the brunt of it. We cannot. So what is needed to be done? What the earlier paradigm of growth had told us, that you need to transition from rural to urban. The aim of that, or the larger significant pointing that it would do, was the fact that rural is something which is not good, underdeveloped, urban would be developed. So that is why frequently you would hear news stories and articles that in India, the rate of urbanization and the rate of industrialization, that is slow. That is why India is not developing at the pace that it should. Now, this article, and largely if you think about it, there is a counterpoint as well. And the counterpoint is, let's simply for a brief moment forget what the Western world has taught us. Let us take a look at what doyens of Indian growth have talked about even in pre-independent India. And here the article talks about none other than Mahatma Gandhi. Now you would have read time and again in history, in polity, in various subjects, how Mahatma Gandhi always stood for self-sufficiency and local production. So self-sufficiency here, while it definitely means producing on your own, but self-sufficiency at rural levels. Okay? Rural area should not be looked down upon as a problem. Rural area basically constitutes close to around 65% of our population as per our last census. 65% of the national population still lives in around rural areas. So if that much amount of population, you cannot think about a long-term growth pattern that all of this will migrate to the urban areas. Sadly, that is what our design of growth has been. That is why the urban areas have been cluttered. That is why the urban problems are on the rise. And when I say urban problems, the problems of pollution, lack of affordable housing, lack of adequate amount of energy, clean drinking water, sanitation, urban flooding, all of these are why? Because of rampant rural to urban migration. So rather than going for the same growth pattern, let us try to make the rural areas self-sufficient. This is what even the directive principles of our state policy, they also mention about this. Each of the rural areas should be their own producing centers. You need not have very large industries. Rather, the large industries also have their own place, but you can have the semi-level or the semi-scale of these industries. MSMEs should be promoted, right? So promotion of MSMEs should be encouraged. Okay? Now, MSMEs, anyways, in the economic setup, is the largest provider of employment in our country. The large industries, they don't provide much employment. The largest, more than 90% of the employment in the industrial sector is generated by the MSMEs. So these MSMEs, they can be made more eco-friendly. and they can serve their own region in a more self-sufficient manner, so that not only will you be able to cap this migration, you will be able to tap the potential of that area and have a well-meaning growth, getting rid of the economic scourge of inequality. Because as the economic inequality rises, social strife and social discontent also quickly follows. So that should not be the case. That is what this article argues about. Okay, so in this article, very briefly, what we have discussed? We have basically discussed the model of growth. First of all, what is the model of growth indicated? Model of economic growth. What is the problem that India is facing? A direct transition from an agrarian nation to a kind of services nation that has reduced our overall capacity to improve the manufacturing also and improve the per capita income levels as well, right? So in the case of India is what we have discussed. Case of India. Then we have discussed about what is the problem in terms of climate change that follows if we pursue the normal economic growth model, and what should be the way forward. Okay? Now, then we move on to the third article again, which has appeared in the editorial section of the newspaper. This is relevant for your GS paper too. So NB8 visit to India focuses on cooperation and trust. Now, what is this NB8? Now look at who have written the article. Who are the authors of the article? Minister of Foreign Affairs Denmark, Minister of Foreign Affairs Estonia, Minister of Foreign Affairs Finland, Minister of Foreign Affairs Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden. So that tells you what NB8 is. So again, on the backdrop of the rise in our dialogue which is happening, there is a European delegation of NB8 which is visiting India, which is meeting the highest levels of Indian government, and they are urging India. What behind the room talks are going on, that is something that the world is not privy to, but various different news sources have cited that they are urging India to step in, talk with Russia, and thereby agree upon a ceasefire in Russia-Ukraine and find a middle path. So that is what this entire conventional visit is about, and this entire visit is about. Now, this NB8 has issued multiple statements criticizing Russia, that how the Russian action in Ukraine is a unilateral attack on democratic values, because Russia is seeking to change the entire, let's suppose, the security apparatus, the boundaries of Ukraine unilaterally. While you would have heard about these allegations and the counterpoints multiple times, and we have talked about it in the first article as well, we use this to focus on NB8. What is this NB8? And what does N and B stand for? So when we talk about NB8, it is the Nordic-Baltic cooperation of 8 countries. That is the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries. Which are the Nordic and the Baltic countries? Historically, they have a civilizational connect, right? The Nords, the Celts, etc., they have a civilizational connect going back thousands of years. So here, the Nordic countries of Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, right? This is the country that is Denmark. Along with the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These are also what are referred to as the Baltic nations. Now, these nations, they have a larger, as I told you, cultural and historical connect. They have almost a very similar kind of geography and a geographical, geopolitical interest. They are surrounded by one of the erstwhile largest superpowers and now one of the largest countries of the world in the form of Russia. So in a way, they also share a common threat. They are all threatened by climate change, being in the polar region in a similar manner. So they have lot of things that they can agree upon, and where the interests converge. That is where the NB8 cooperation was formed, for the informal discussions and the informal cooperation that these countries can take and hold a unified agenda in front of the global community. Because if you think about it, a country like Finland, for example, if it comes to the global forums and global groupings and asks for something, you can obviously imagine what its bargaining power will be. It will be substantially less. If a country like Sweden individually goes along and talks about trade parameters and softening of trade norms, you can again imagine what its bargaining power will be. But together, they form a large market. Together, they form a group which can be included, as the article also argues, can be included in the G10 nations. Right? So that is why this NB8 grouping was formed. Now, for your prelims, you need to be able to understand what the NB8 is, which are the countries which are included in this NB8. This is where you have the Baltic Sea and hence the Baltic nations. Baltic Sea. Okay. Now, when it comes to India, even last year and for the last couple of years, the Confederation of Indian Industries, for example, had held a meeting and invited these NB8 nations for greater cooperation. And when it comes to India and NB8, there are huge sectors for cooperation which opens itself. Right? So here, areas of cooperation where both of them can benefit: blue economy. Significant amount of maritime resources are present in that area. Understand, these are the regions of world's largest fjords, some of the world's significant and largest reefs, cold water coral reefs present in that area. So the maritime resources are quite significant. These are the countries which also have significant amount of fossil fuel reserves. Right? So that can also be beneficial. Food processing and sustainability. This is where Indian exports, agricultural exports, can significantly help. Because in these polar countries, agricultural growth is stymied due to the climatic conditions. And a country like India, which is amongst the largest producers of grains in the world, can step in and benefit. The bilateral trade between the countries as of past year was already touching close to around $5 to $6 billion. So that is why there is a huge scope of improvement. The transition to the green energy, that is what these countries are also interested in. That is what India is also interested in. Because again, polar climate change is going to impact them very quickly and is already impacting them. Then space tech and polar research, student exchanges, and culture and tourism. All these can be revenue generating. And people-to-people exchange can lead to significant amount of understanding of the local cultures as well. Understand, India's draft Arctic policy, if you recall that, under India's Arctic policy, India talks about connecting the poles. And there, India is not restricted to the North and the South Pole. India also talks about the third pole, that is the Himalayas. Right? So we have people living high up in the snowy mountain. That is where the cultural aspect comes into place. And the people living in the high snowy mountains, they are also getting impacted by the climate change almost at the equal measure as these NB8 nations. So that is again a zone and an area of cooperation. Again, India's Arctic policy also talks about cooperation with these nations in order to understand the impact of climate change on Indian monsoon. For example, what is the temperature observed in these areas of the water body? That has got a bearing on Indian monsoonal rainfall as well. So that is why India wants to improve and increase the polar research, because that will be relevant for our monsoon prediction. And we all know how important monsoons are for a country like India. Okay, so these are the areas of cooperation. These are the areas which both the regions should be looking at. Now, even though this article again talks about Russia, Ukraine, etc. But you don't have to extract that for your exams because you have been hearing that continuously for the past 2 years. I am sure you will be able to write a long essay, couple of essays about that on your own. So always suggested that look at these particular snippets which can be asked. I'll tell you what kind of mains questions can be framed from that and how to write an answer on that. Now, then coming to the fourth article that is going to be relevant for your GS paper 3. India's stance on data transfers at WTO spooks semiconductor industry giants. This has appeared in page 14, the business page, and this is relevant for your GS paper 3. Now, what is it? So basically, understand the brief backdrop of it. Now, when it comes to matters of e-commerce, World Trade Organization since 1998 has put forward a moratorium on the duties that are imposed on e-commerce. So since 98, excuse me, since 1998, global moratorium. Moratorium means you are not imposing any duties on e-commerce, right? Imposed by WTO. Now, time and time again, the ministerial committees, which is the highest decision-making body of the WTO, that has been extending the moratorium time and time again. Now, here when you think about e-commerce, please don't think about the e-commerce websites that are being used and that is in relevance nowadays. No. E-commerce as per WTO, basically, if you talk about it, so the WTO work program on e-commerce defines e-commerce as the production, distribution, marketing, sale or delivery of goods and services by electronic means. Again, marketing, sale and delivery of goods and services by electronic means. So this can mean movies, music, books, games. So much so, even if you think about it, 3D printing, all of that. So all of this is covered under the WTO guidelines for e-commerce. Now on these, there is a moratorium on duties. That is, you don't impose taxes. Now what does that mean, you don't impose taxes? And how is it going to refer us? How is it going to impact us? Why should we care for it? And why is it that India is against that moratorium? Because the headline says, India's stance on data transfers at WTO, because India is opposing that moratorium now. Now, basically, in 1998, this entire idea of books, movies, music being generated and transferred through internet, that was something which was very new to the world, even for the developed world. It was a very new concept. And the world did not understand how to impose a policy, how to impose, let's suppose, taxation on this. So that is why WTO formed a working committee, and it was decided by the ministerial committee that let's take up a working committee, let us understand what this is. Until that, let's impose a ban on any revenue duty or import tax. So a country like, let's suppose, US. Let's suppose a country like US. If US is exporting, any good to India, India will impose tax on it, isn't it? India imposes tax. Now, when India imposes tax, it increases revenue in India, increases revenue, and we all know how important this revenue is For developing nations like India, South Africa, Indonesia, actually these are the countries who are opposing the moratorium most vehemently. So for any good normally that US would transfer or trade, India would impose revenue or a tariff or a tax. Now, for the goods which fall under the purview of e-commerce, movies, books, music, all of these, games, gaming industry is one of the fastest growing industries in the entirety of the world. Now, in that case, they are exempt from taxes. Now, who will have a better ability to produce these objects or at a better standard? Whose industry would be better when it comes to the electronic production of movies, games, music, books, etc.? Always the US and the developed nations. So what the developed nations are doing, they are transferring and sending huge amount of these goods and services, and that is tax-free. So for them, isn't it beneficial? How? Because of advancement of technology. If US is producing an e-commerce good, it is able to produce it at a lower price. Because of our technological difficulties, our industry is still growing, though growing at a very fast rate. We are producing it at a higher price. Now we impose duties to keep the price parity. But if, let's suppose, there is an exemption on duty, the goods that you get from US end up being cheaper. So which good will you buy? Always the goods which are imported? So what will happen to your domestic industry? Due to lack of demand, that industry will die an untimely death, isn't it? So as a result of that, developing countries have been noticing for the past 5 to 7 years now that because of this moratorium, our own domestic industry is not rapidly expanding, it is not growing. So for some time now, India had made its point clear that we want this moratorium to end. We will impose taxes on the import of goods from these countries to India. Why? It will help our industrial growth. It will also help basically why the stance to end moratorium, if you think about it. First of all, impose tax on imported goods. Imported goods should be taxed after all, isn't it? For various purposes. Price parity, then increase in revenue, then support to local industry. Isn't it? This is why India, Indonesia, South Africa, they are very determined that in this ministerial committee meeting of WTO, which is going to be held in Abu Dhabi, all of them are inclined towards ending this moratorium, and the stance has been made clear. Now, in that phase or in that scenario, you have the semiconductor industry giants, again from the developed nations, who have written a long letter to the Prime Minister of India that, look, what you have been pitching for about the growth of the semiconductor industry, that India has to become a global giant in semiconductor industry, but when you put an end to this moratorium, means that free design flow which was happening or which could happen, that might also be endangered. So the risk that they are indicating, the risk that they are showing that India will face is the fact that the semiconductor design industry, that will be damaged. But anyways, no semiconductor company in the world will be ready to share their critical designs with you free of cost. No semiconductor, regardless of howsoever uh, good and virtuous any country or any company is, they won't share these critical designs free of cost. So that is never going to happen, right? So this risk, for that matter, that is largely unfounded. So while India is seeking to develop the semiconductor industry, it would be very able, and this is the part of the opinion, that it should be ably supported by our own domestic sector, because we have some of the best design talents, and that is where few of the companies have already set up their semiconductor foundries. And there, we don't need to be scared that this risk is going to hold us back. And the article, and in this letter, they have said that, look, the entire chip manufacturing process, etc., will be damaged. Then, for example, let's suppose you are talking about automobile manufacturing. If the chip supply line is damaged, your automobile sector will suffer, and so on. But India is losing, and the developing nation is losing close to around $10 billion of revenue as a result of this moratorium. So for the developing nations of the world, this is absolutely unaffordable and a price that we are paying. 3D printing sector is not developing because of that. The movie production business is not improving because of that. The books, music industry has got a significantly unfavored competition because of that. Okay, so that is the context of this entire article. Now coming to some of the topics relevant for your prelims, starting with, first of all, the Aditya L1 mission and the PAPA module of the Aditya L1 mission that has reported and measured the CME, the coronal mass ejection. Now, what is that PAPA module? So it is the plasma analyzer package for Aditya. So its work is to study coronal mass ejections, CMEs. Coronal mass ejections. That is it, what it wants to study. Now, what are these coronal mass ejections? So they are large expulsions of plasma and magnetic field from the sun, which traverse into the solar system, right? So they propagate outward into the interplanetary space. That is CME. So it starts developing because of magnetic field and thermal anomalies which develop on the solar surface, and that is then basically expelled into the solar system. Now, unlike the solar flares, these do not travel very quickly. They travel at a comparatively leisure time period. A solar flare can reach from the sun to the planet Earth within a few hours, right? This can sometimes take more than that. Sometimes it can take certain weeks, certain days as well. Okay, but when this CME hits the exo-atmospheric system, particularly around the poles, while it can cause significantly picturesque auroras, the northern and the southern lights, at the same time, it can also cause communication disruptions. Okay, communication disruptions can be caused. Right? That is the impact of CME that is relevant for your exam. Okay. Now, gray zone warfare, latest entry in lexicon of warfare, says the Chief of Defense Staff. So what is this gray zone warfare? Gray zone basically means that you are not in a constant state of war. You are not in a constant state of cooperation. So you are somewhere in between. So on various parameters, your stance will appear to be very similar, as if you are at war with another country. But on other parameters, there will be significant cooperation which will be there. So when it comes to countries such as India, China, right? Let's suppose in certain cases, even for that matter, China and US, they trade in volumes close to around $800 billion. But still in many areas, for example, the naval confrontation, etc., it will appear as if they are at war. So that is the categorization, what is referred to as gray zone warfare. This article basically talks about that now there needs to be a greater international cooperation between the various different forces in order to adapt to the gray zone warfare, because you never know when this can escalate to a confrontation and when this can eventually turn out to be a war-like scenario. But consistently, you have to be prepared for cooperation. Okay, so that is the stance for gray zone warfare. Now coming to the last article. PSBs can now check on big borrowers on a unified portal. Now, a unified portal has been developed by two agencies. So basically, it has been developed by Central Economic Intelligence Bureau. With the collaboration of SBI, State Bank of India. Now, this CEIB has basically established a portal whereby the large borrowers, they might have a previous borrowing record, which might be good, which might not be good. Okay, their previous borrowing record might be, sometimes they would not have paid the earlier loans, sometimes they would have succeeded in hiding their previous finances also. There have been various instances, particularly in our financial sector, where many of the companies, they go bankrupt, they have gone bankrupt, and the owners of that, they have successfully managed to borrow loans and establish a newer organization, which can also go bust. So that is why, in order to protect the investments and the loans that these banks give out, they need to check these borrowers and their entire credential. Not borrower like you and me. Borrowers, we are talking about those who borrow in hundreds and thousands of crores. Because why? In order to save the incidents and the events of NPA. Okay, to reduce the burden of NPA. So that is what the CEIB and the SBI have done. So here a question can be framed regarding what that unified portal is, what is its purpose, who has set it up. Now let us take a look at the practice question. Now, discuss the importance of changing the paradigm of growth in developing countries in the light of climate change. Now, this is a 10-marker question, 150 word. The introduction of it should not focus on the paradigm of growth in itself or only on climate change. Just talk about, in a generalistic sweeping manner, that the general or the accepted model of growth indicated across the world follows an approach of burning fossil fuels and achieving faster growth. In the event where the impact of climate change is already upon us, that approach needs a relook and, if possible, a change. That is your introduction in itself, very brief and concise. Then in the body, you mention about those paradigm of growth from rural to urban and from agrarian to industrial to services. Talk about the 4 foundational parameters required to achieving that growth: steel, concrete, plastic, and also food. How all of them require significant amount of fossil fuel burning, emission that can be damaging. And in the later part of the body, direct and pivot the answer towards a kind of way forward. That what needs to be actually done is to make local centers of growth and decentralized centers of growth around these rural economies and the rural areas to make them self-sufficient. And here you can also list out and underline, as stated by Mahatma Gandhi, also mentioned in the Part 4 of the Indian Constitution under the directive principles of state policy. So that is how you can authenticate. Eventually, while you conclude, very briefly, you can also talk about that how, moving ahead into the 21st century, the growth needs to be inclusive and not numeric. Numeric means the GDP numbers, etc. Okay? Only then the malaise of inequality shall be taken care of once and for all. Okay? And that needs a change of paradigm. So that will be your comprehensive answer. Now, what are NB8 countries? Discuss the scope of cooperation between India and NB8 countries. So the introduction talk about the NB8 countries. Then very briefly in the body part talk about what they share in commonality. Then talk about India's role and India's cooperation. That is how you can write the answer. Okay, so that shall be all for today's newspaper analysis. We meet again tomorrow, today in evening at 7 p.m. Join me for the special class on jet streams. Until we meet again tomorrow for the newspaper analysis, do take care of yourself. If you have liked the video, please don't forget to click on the like, share and subscribe button. Thank you.